everyone, and welcome to the Billy Dees podcast. I'm absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked out our program before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. You can find the Billy Dees podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found, including Apple Podcasts. I would have to say that's the majority of our audience right there. And Spotify, boy, Spotify is coming on strong with hosting podcasts and all that stuff, and we're on both. So it's a pleasure to have you. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to say that we probably should issue just a little bit of a trigger warning. If you are a trauma survivor of any kind, there might be some things that are discussed in today's program that could be a trigger for you, and we don't want that to happen. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there. Our guest today is Erika Port. Erika, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Let me tell the audience just a little bit about you. Erika is a businesswoman from the Cleveland area. She is an advocate for abuse survivors, especially in regard to why many of them do not realize that they have been abused until years later. And as you well know, that often comes up when these stories break on the news. Everyone always asks, why did they wait so long to say anything? We're going to discuss that today. Erika is also somewhat unique in her study of this subject because she has also interviewed sex offenders, which I have to say is somewhat unique. And she's done this since 2015. Erika has heard sex offenders share how they became sex offenders. Wow, that's quite a mission. Now, you are in Cleveland now. Were you always from Cleveland?
Yeah, born and raised.
Yeah, born and raised. So obviously you're in business. You do a lot with advocacy. You're very busy. In your spare time, what do you do? Are you like a Browns fan? You got to be a Browns fan, right?
Well, my husband's the Browns fan.
Oh, okay.
I support him in that, though.
Very good. Yes, I've been a suffering Browns fan for a long time, but this last year, as you probably know, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. So we're hoping for the best for next year. You yourself, as we discussed, have a journey as a survivor. Okay. Do you want to share a little bit about your experience so the audience has a basic understanding of what you've been through and where you're coming from with all of this?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So I was abused starting at the age of 14. It was my freshman year of high school, and a senior started paying attention to me. So I was kind of at the end or the bottom of the totem pole. It was a very new environment, new people, and I was excited that someone was paying attention to me. And this particular individual was showering me with compliments and, saying all the right things and things that I wanted to hear, and got into a relationship pretty quickly. And the abuse happened pretty quickly. The abuse entailed verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. And it was really detrimental to me because this was my first relationship. So it was really what I viewed, as a relationship. And it really kind of set me up, in my future relationships, not necessarily on the best path.
Sure. And this is something that a lot of people, from my experience, I'm not an expert, but in talking to people who have gone through these types of situations, especially with an abuser in a domestic situation, it very seldom just like starts on one day. I mean, like one day they're Prince Charming, and the next day it gradually happens. And I just wanted to know if that's kind of how this led up to the situation in your case. I mean, how did this all start? How do you feel that you were singled out, so to speak?
Well, I will say this, that no one gets into a relationship wanting to be abused. No one gets into a relationship thinking they're going to be abused. And it often does happen very insidiously. And so, I look back in hindsight and, I remember questioning why me? And I was very vulnerable. not only being a freshman in a new environment, but when you really look at how 14-year-olds are, they're very curious. They want to fit in with their peer group. They want to have more independence. And, I also grew up in an environment where I didn't have, my mother was a single mother, so I didn't really see what healthy relationships were supposed to look like.
Yeah.
We didn't really talk about those things either. And so I was just very vulnerable. And, I do think that abusers target individuals. And I also think I did not have good boundary knowledge then. I actually didn't even really know what boundaries were. It was something where I kind of laugh about, where I knew it was a word in the dictionary, but I did not know how boundaries applied to my life. And so there was a lot of boundary testing early on. And I just think there were a lot of factors that, factored into how and why he chose me.
Yeah. How long did this go on approximately?
Yeah, well, we dated for, I want to say, roughly a year and a half, and it was a very rough relationship, and it didn't end when we broke up. This was something that lasted even into my 20s, where he would reach out to me when I had asked him to not reach out to me. He would just find ways to find me. Mm-hmm. And that was really disturbing, actually.
Sure. One of the questions that people often ask survivors is, why didn't you just leave? And a lot of times that comes from not understanding the psychology, the cycle that you can fall into. In your case, youth, certainly. You were at a stage in your life where your emotions were coming out, and you didn't necessarily know how to handle that. So you had a lot on your plate. But can you speak a little bit? I know you've talked to a lot of people as to why sometimes it's not as easy as people say it is. Well, just walk out the door. Why is it more complicated than that?
It's so complicated. And first, I want to say that I think it's really important for people to start shifting the narrative. So instead of saying, why did a victim do or didn't do something, really look at, questioning the perpetrator and why, they were abusive, and oftentimes why they did criminal behavior. And so there's so many reasons people stay. And one of the biggest reasons that people stay is because actually leaving and exiting a relationship can be one of the most hazardous times to leave. Oftentimes there are threats. Oftentimes, there's more violence.
Yeah.
It could be a financial issue. There really is a host of issues. And I really encourage anyone listening to this to look up, why don't victims leave their abusers? I mean, there's a host of reasons.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about one of the red flags. I'm going to presume you're going to talk about control, because that's usually one of the red flags for somebody who's in a new relationship. When people want to know who your friends are, how often you're seeing them, and they want to get control of the bank statements and all these other things. That's usually, in my estimation, a red flag. When did you realize that it was time to take action? How did that come together in your mind?
Well, for me, with my personal journey, my abuser was not only abusing me, but he was abusing my friends. And my friends were also minors at the time. And I think I just hit a rock bottom emotionally. And I remember just, and I don't even think I was really religious or anything at the time, but I just remember like praying to something, please help me leave this relationship. And I was able to move on physically, because I actually got into another relationship quickly. So I was able to move on from that. But there was just a moment of a rock bottom for me that I could not continue on that way.
Yeah. That's so often the case when I talk to people and they have a personal journey of some kind, whether it be addiction or what have you. It's unfortunate that it has to be one of those rock bottom situations. But sometimes that's when you have nowhere else to go. and you realize that you have to take action. How did you begin your recovery? So you reached that threshold where, okay, I got to change this. You were able to take action. You had to realize that you were hurt, and possibly traumatized by all this. How did you begin your recovery?
Yeah. So, I think when I was in the abuse and experiencing it, I knew it didn't feel good a lot of the time, but I did not recognize labels associated with it. I did not recognize rape. I did not recognize emotional abuse and, all those labels of what those types of abuse entail. And so it actually was in my early 20s, almost a decade later, that someone had to actually tell me those labels.
Yeah.
Erika, that's sexual abuse. Erika, that's emotional abuse. And I was in a place in my life where I think, especially because I was out of the abuse, I could hear it for what it was, bask in what I was being told, and just have this moment of, oh my gosh, it really was that bad.
Yeah. That's something that I think is important to anyone listening. You didn't realize how bad it was until you were out, which can be a real problematic to anyone who's in the situation. They may not realize how bad it is. So we spoke about red flags, and I alluded to a few of them. What would be some of the red flags, whether it be a family member? I had a friend I was talking to, her daughter got into a situation where she was married to an abuser, and some of the things that she learned about how her daughter was behaving early on, she knows now were red flags, one of which he took control of the finances. He did other things. What would be some of the red flags that you would want to point out?
Well, I think if I were to say if it's from a parent and their child is in a new relationship, I will say this, having been in support groups with parents of children who have been abused too, is really trust your gut. You know your child. I understand there is a big difference of understanding what is teenage behavior versus, other behavior. But
Right.
if you feel something in your gut is wrong, please follow that intuition and that gut feeling, because it's there to tell you something. I also think that abusers, some other core aspects of abuse and control is isolating their victim.
Yes.
So this could be where, maybe they were once a bubbly person, had, a social life. All of a sudden, they're spending most, if not all, their time with their abuser. I also think, like you mentioned before, there's the financial abuse piece that often comes later on. It's not like
Sure.
someone gets into a relationship and
hands over the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I also think too, that there's different power dynamics too. Like, what are the power dynamics of the relationship? And age differences, or, there could be myriad different things to look at, but yeah, I would say control and isolating a victim are certainly hallmarks of abuse.
Yeah. You have interviewed offenders, sex offenders in a lot of cases. My first question would be, how did you get started doing that? What was the catalyst to get that started?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
So I am also in a survivors group. And so the offenders that we interview, part of their program and treatment is to actually sit in front of a group of survivors, to kind of have a dialogue and have an interviewing style type, question answer. And so it's interesting to hear their journeys, but I also think they find it interesting to hear survivors' journey too, and the impacts of their abuse. So basically it's from a survivor support group, and it's, it's our choice to partake in it. But certainly I was intrigued to be part of it. And like you said, I've been part of it since 2015.
Yeah. Your first time talking to one, were you nervous?
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
I went into it not knowing what to expect, because I knew it was a very unique, different experience. And, while they weren't my abuser, they certainly were an abuser for other people. And I also found it cathartic to do it, to be able to walk in. And I will tell you, I think a lot of victims carry shame with them. And I will tell you, the interesting dynamic is when I walked into the room to interview these offenders, they had a very hard time looking at us, making eye contact. And it almost was like the dynamic changed. It seemed like they actually carried the shame, which was interesting.
Yeah. What are some of the common paths that they had in their background that led them to this kind of behavior?
Yeah. So there's different types of sex offenders, right? There's offenders that have physical victims, online victims, and I've been able to interview different types of sex offenders. So when we look at their path and how they become a sex offender, oftentimes it's a culmination of family dynamics and their upbringing, but a lot of them actually experience a lot of isolation, depression. They feel like they don't measure up with their peer group. Some antisocial personality disorders. There definitely is a core commonality, generally speaking, across the board.
That's interesting. This next question, I always throw a curveball in there. This isn't one that we kind of went over in our pre-production notes, but I'm going to kind of throw this at you. Was there any time when you were talking to some of these sex offenders that you felt any compassion for them, any sympathy for them, any empathy for them? Was there, because on the surface, someone would probably say you're going to feel anger, you're going to feel hatred. Those would be the ones that I would say are easily predictable. But was there ever a time when maybe you felt bad for any of them?
Yeah. So when I first started, I remember thinking I want to scratch their eyes out. But then I quickly realized that my consequences would be more harsh than theirs. Oftentimes these offenders really only get slaps on the wrist and probation.
Yeah.
So in this time, over several years of interviewing offenders, some of them have been in the program for several years. So I've gotten to know some of them more personally, just through the program, not outside of it or anything. But yes, I've been able to have empathetic responses of, wow, I did not realize that was your experience. And just, I think understanding their journeys was really helpful to know. By all means, it does not excuse their behavior. There are plenty of, I also look at some of these offenders were also abused themselves, sexually abused themselves.
Yeah.
And, that's still not an excuse because there are plenty of victims who have been sexually abused, but they don't go on to offend. But it's been interesting to get to know them in a more personal facet, for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sometimes it's just like people who are, and I'm not in any way making a political statement. I'm just talking about the psychology of things. There's a lot of people who may have had a family member murdered, and it's one thing to say, I want that person to be executed. It's another thing if you're in the prison, for example, and you get to get in touch with that person's humanity, and then it's your job to facilitate their execution. That's a little bit different. And by no means, I'm not excusing any of this, but it's a different psychology when that person becomes humanized. And I think that's really what you're trying to say.
Yeah. I do think society, and rightfully so in many circumstances, view offenders as scum of the earth, right?
Sure.
But I think to your point, getting to know more about them and their personal experiences and even just I don't even want to say it's a journey, but just how they became offenders. It's not like they woke up one day saying, I'm going to go offend and do this. It really is a combination of different factors that led to that point. But yeah, to your point, I do have empathy after hearing more of their experiences, but I do think that there needs to be better rehabilitation programs, more accountability on their end.
Yeah. This is going to be kind of out of left field too. This is a question that I often ask survivors of various kinds. You were exposed to offenders who were in some sort of a program. So I'm presuming that they had some enlightenment as to the wrongdoing that they did, or they wouldn't be in that situation. There's an old argument as nature versus nurture. Do we learn bad behavior or are we born into it? I'm kind of on the fence about that, because I do believe there are some people on some level who are born with certain evil tendencies, and I'm not necessarily religious, but the religious people refer to them as the incorrigibly wicked. They will always turn away from the light. Have you ran across someone who might have been a sex offender who was just totally oblivious to any wrongdoing and was just somebody that inspired nothing but anger in your heart?
Yes. So, in my experience, even interviewing these offenders, I have been able to kind of extrapolate. I think the offenders who have that fighting chance of actually having successful rehabilitation, and there are certainly offenders that I've seen that severely lack empathy, and I know will be habitual reoffenders.
Yeah. That's a tough one. And I've known a few bad people, not necessarily sex offenders, over the years, and it's very hard for me to imagine them in a situation where I'm going to embrace them and trust them. It's just not going to happen. You alluded to the fact that a lot of sex offenders get a slap on the wrist, and sometimes not even that. Do you want to talk a little bit about your feelings about that? And I'll throw my 2 cents in before you start. I feel that we are a society that is obsessed with the rights of the accused. And I understand why that's important. Because the room for abuse is there. However, as a victim, and I'm going to use the word victim in this case, someone who has been victimized, as a victim, you have no rights. You have no habeas corpus, none of that. You don't have the right to an attorney. You don't have free medical attention. You, as far as I know, it might vary from state to state, but you have very little resources as rights when you are the victim of a crime. So what's your take on that?
It's so funny you say that, because I'm actually studying policy through a public health program. And you're right. Criminals have a right to an attorney. Victims do not have a right. And so oftentimes, if they cannot afford an attorney, they have to, reside to legal aid or, these other funded legal systems.
Yes.
And, going back to the offender piece and the slaps on the wrist. So how the program will start off is we'll kind of go around, saying a little bit about our experiences. And so the offenders will go around saying, this is my crime. Here's the time I served, if they served. And I will tell you, it is so common to hear that they were told to do X amount of time in jail, but they get leniency, or they only get probation, or they serve half of their time. And I will tell you, I think the most amount of time I think I heard someone serve was 3 years. And, when it comes back to the survivor group, I really like to tell the offenders that, while you got these slaps on the wrist, survivors and the impact really get this life sentence, because we carry the effects of abuse with us. By all means, it doesn't have to define us. It doesn't have to run our lives, but for many of us, it does.
Sure.
And that's so unfair.
Yeah. I really have an empathy, I would say, for even if a person is mugged, whatever has, especially when it's violence. I'm liberal in some cases. If I'm in the gym and somebody steals $50 out of my wallet, all right, it doesn't make my day, but I'm not necessarily going to hunt them down and try to kill them. Okay. But when you steal that $50, in the process, you stab a pregnant woman at an ATM machine. Okay. Now I don't have empathy for that. I don't have any understanding of that. I have a zero tolerance of that. So this here, I got mixed emotions on, because, sex offenders, they hurt people, they traumatize them. And it's not just a matter of getting your car window smashed while it's parked somewhere and something's missing. Okay, it's inconvenient, but I wouldn't necessarily be traumatized by that. And I just have a hard time myself granting somebody like that a lot of leniency, and especially when it comes to sexual crimes. it's often the cliche is it's a he said she said situation, and 9 times out of 10 they walk away. If they
Right.
get any sentence at all, it's very light. Is that kind of how you feel about it? Am I right in that assumption?
Yeah. Sexual violent crimes are the most underreported crimes, and they are often the most difficult to prove. I think a lot of times, and I've actually gone through the legal system myself. So and then even working with abuse survivors and helping them navigate that, there's so much burden on the victim, right?
Yes.
There's asking them to recall their experience numerous times.
Yeah.
And how trauma works is over time, you might remember more details. It's hard to piece together. And so, detectives trying to solve this crime, if there's new evidence or new parts to the survivor's experience, they view that as, oh, well, that's not what you said before. How can
Yeah.
and the burden is just so on victims.
Yes.
Yeah.
I understand why police make people repeat the stories, because oftentimes if there's inconsistencies, that can be a problem. Okay. But by the same token, it doesn't put someone who's been traumatized, especially in the most personal manner,
Mhm.
in a very good situation. I feel there has to be a better way to handle that. Speaking of being underreported, one of the reasons why women don't come forth a lot of times is just as you said, because what they have to go through versus what the chances are that you're going to get anything back is very small. And men are often survivors as well. They
Mhm.
often have things done to them, and they have the societal pressure of having, as a man, to explain how they've been victimized. Um, you've talked to a lot of people. What's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, men certainly are abuse victims, and they also have different challenges than women face. If they were to disclose or come forward about their abuse, I think sexual violence in and of itself is very difficult to come forward. But I think with men, it's the stigmas are, a lot of people believe men can't be raped. A lot of people, if a man comes forward, and especially if they were molested or inappropriately touched or anything by a woman, men view that as, oh man, you scored. What do you like? Why do you care? And it's still super traumatizing. And
Yeah.
men just have a whole different, battle to climb. So
Yeah. The message I would have to men is, if you believe that you need help, if something has happened to you, sexual or otherwise, and you feel that you need help, a lot of times men don't want to come forward with emotional problems because they feel it's a sign of weakness. That's not something that men do, as it were. And so many times help is just that far away. All you have to do is take a step and ask for it. And getting around those roadblocks of whether it be shame or anything else, in the long run, you feel so much better when you just get the help that you need. Speaking of help, what message of hope would you have for survivors and their families? And what are some of the best recovery resources that are out there that people can use?
sure. So first, I just want to say that on average, people, it takes roughly 10 years to come out to talk about abuse. So, some people, and when I say the average, that means some people carry it to their grave with them, and some
Yeah.
people, disclose, the time that it happened. So, but on average, it's almost a decade later. So, I also want to say that it's never too late to heal. It's never too late to talk about what happened. And just from personal experience and helping other survivors, both men and women, through this process, oftentimes survivors will report just having this weight lifted off, just even talking about it. And I just want to say that if you've experienced abuse, it's not your fault. And there's certainly are resources out there, and a lot of free resources, even. In the Cleveland area, there's a great resource, Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. They have, tons of free resources and counseling services and, live chat, text options, that are all anonymous too. So there's that, RAIN, which is, a national network. They can also assist you with local resources. And certainly, a lot of people find counseling helpful. But I think really the first step is talking about it, and doing what's best for you in your own time. So that's what I would have to say in terms of resources and advice.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, when something breaks in the news, an accuser comes forward and it's a public figure and it's something that happened 20 years ago, typically people jump on it. And quite frankly, I'm not one for any type of knee-jerk reaction. I don't want to automatically convict someone, but I don't want to automatically discredit someone either. I think you have to be objective. You have to take these things seriously. But one of the things people often question in that scenario is, why did they wait so long? And you spoke about that a little bit. Is there anything more you want to add as to why sometimes when it's a public figure, it might be, I've heard 50, the age of 50 a lot of times, to the point where you have the maturity and the understanding of what happened to you to be able to talk about it.
Yeah. So there's so many reasons why people wait, especially when the abuse is happening. Say it's in a work environment, and if it's by a boss or a coworker, oftentimes victims would worry about ostracization in work or retaliation, fear of not being believed, fear of being blamed. Who is the abuser? Oftentimes abusers will insert themselves into these positive lights. So a lot of times we see pastors abusing,
yes.
right? Because, if they're accused, so many people, because they're in this positive light, or they do so many good things for the community, or they just have this good reputation, it's very easy to believe the perpetrator and the one accused than the victim.
Yes.
And so oftentimes we see, as people come forward years later about an individual, these perpetrators often, if not most of the time, have numerous victims, right? It's not like they offend once. So over this time, they have numerous victims. And when one person comes forward, it gives courage for other victims to come forward who carry that, experience alone and in their own shame. And they see someone else coming forward and they say, oh my gosh, this happened to me too.
Sure.
And that's why we see, people come out in numbers oftentimes years later.
Sure. Yeah. And I want to stress to the audience, in the last couple of years with the Me Too movement and everything, you've heard the mantra, always believe victims. It doesn't necessarily mean try and convict them. What it means is give the accusation enough credence to investigate it. Like you said, so many times somebody in a position of authority, let's say, for example, may abuse someone who is addicted to drugs. So naturally, everybody says, well, who's going to believe the quote unquote drug addict in relation to the councilman? And that's where those things get dismissed. And that's where you have to give that accusation an investigation. You have to give it credence. You have to give it, you can't just dismiss anything out of hand. That's what they're really trying to say. Am I right about that?
Yeah. And I will say this too. One of the biggest fears victims face is that when they do come forward, that they won't be believed. And so when people do come forward publicly, especially, we all see the comments and, not believing the victim or asking what the victim did or didn't do or why this or why that, right? Yeah. That is incredibly difficult for a victim for a crime that befell onto them. And so it's so important to believe a victim when they come forward, because it really can shape the trajectory of their healing process, right?
Absolutely.
Like we all know that there are perpetrators out there, right? Like we all know that. Mm-hmm. And so when someone comes out about being abused by someone, why are we dismissing it so quickly, right? Yes. Like, why are we not investigating it to the level it deserves?
Yes.
So, yeah.
I would only add, and I'll ask your opinion about this, that political ideological filters are now playing a big role in this. If someone gets accused and they're a popular Republican, the Republicans and the Democrats are on opposite sides, and the exact same thing happens when it's a Democrat. They flip. Who was for before is against now, and the other way around. There should be none of that. In the idea that you're defending someone because they're politically aligned with you, or you enjoy their music or their entertainment, that all has to be stripped away. You've got to look at the situation.
Correct. Abuse and sexual violence in and of itself doesn't discriminate. Certainly, there are areas of higher rates of abuse, like you mentioned before. It could be disability, individuals who face substance use, just a host of different inequities, really.
Yes.
And so it's really important to, put aside anything political, because sexual violence does not discriminate. It can happen
Yes.
to anybody.
Yeah. And the last thing you want to do as a good person, what I would say is a good person, the last thing you want to put someone who's a survivor to begin with, they've been traumatized. They have to go through, in the case of rape kits and all that, very invasive, humiliating tests. They go through all these interrogations, and then the last thing you want to do is make them a political pawn or something like that. I think that's the height. I sometimes wonder if, as a society, we're just as bad as victimizing them all over again. And yes, I absolutely hear your point on that. We are talking to Erika Port, and like I said, she is an advocate for these types of things. And I know your social media presence is fairly strong. Let's start with Twitter. What are you on Twitter?
Sure. So my Twitter is with my name, but my handle is Egality Matters.
Egality Matters. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned TikTok. And I know a lot of people out there might TikTok, but I'll tell you, the attitude about that is changing. A couple of years ago, everybody kind of laughed it off. And I'm with Gary Vaynerchuk on that. I don't know if you know who he is, but, people who laughed off Facebook and Instagram a few years ago are playing catch up with all their competitors now. Don't blow off TikTok. I believe it does have value as a marketing tool and other things. And you want to just briefly share what happened with that story? You mentioned it in one of your emails about how you had one go viral.
Yes. So I hopped on the TikTok train, and I talked about my experience interviewing sex offenders. And I shared one of the most baffling things a perpetrator has ever said to me. And, it's a short 60-second video, and did not expect it to take off. It actually garnered around 100,000 views and 40,000 likes. And it actually was really cool because it created a community where a lot of survivors came forward and shared in the comments of the abuse that happened to them and even what their perpetrator said. And I actually did not see any trolls hopping in to bash any victims, which I just thought was fascinating. And unfortunately, TikTok took down my video and actually said that it was against their bullying and harassment guidelines. And I found that fascinating because I'm talking about a perpetrator and what they said, and there was nothing graphic. It was just what they said. And somehow, went against their guidelines.
If you want to share what the content was, I'd be happy to hear it.
Yes. So when I was interviewing an offender one time, this particular offender had raped his friend, and how he did it was he got her really intoxicated. His motive was to intoxicate her, and he actually thought that he was doing his friend a favor by intoxicating her to a certain level. And I had said to this perpetrator, so you think that intoxicating your friend was doing them a favor so that you could rape them? And then, when she wakes up, you don't think she's going to recognize something happened to her, like her body doesn't feel like something happened to it. And, so I looked at this perpetrator in his eyes and said this, and he goes, well, I guess I didn't think of that. And I said, well, of course you didn't think of that,
Yes.
Yeah. And I just found it baffling. And this is not the only, interesting offender, response I've heard. And I'll share this really quickly too.
Sure, go ahead.
The offenders that have online victims, that look at child pornography, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their mental gymnastics that they have is that, well, it's already out there, like it's not a physical victim. I'm not physically doing anything. But what they don't realize and recognize is that they're creating demand for that child pornography.
Yeah.
So it has been interesting to just hear kind of the mental gymnastics that they have.
Yeah, it's amazing how they will work around the things that they are doing wrong. It's here again. I have experience with what I would call bad behaving people. None of them sexually, but otherwise what I would call a criminal element. And there's always an excuse as to why whatever they did isn't as bad as what the other guy did. And it's an interesting psychology for sure. What is your screen name on TikTok?
Erika, Erika, period, with period, AK.
Okay, good. Is there any other online presence that you have that you would like to share?
Yeah, I would just say, Google my name, Erika Port, and I'm certainly on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on, LinkedIn, all that stuff. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. We have been talking to Erika Port, businesswoman from the Cleveland area. Cleveland area is probably fair enough to say, right? Mm-hmm. And very much an advocate for survivors of abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. Do search her out. Erika, thank you very much for coming on the program today. It really means a lot to me. That I know it's a tough subject. It's a sensitive subject, and quite frankly, sometimes it's one that I'm a little nervous about talking about because I don't want to offend anyone. I certainly don't want to offend you or the audience. But you made me feel very comfortable, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate your curiosity and having me on. So.
Awesome. I am Billy Dees, and as far as my social media presence, you can find me on Twitter. That's kind of like my social media home. I happen to feel that Twitter was built for podcasting, at Billy Dees on Twitter. And actually, Billy Dees is my screen name on everything. I'm on most of the major platforms. So you can find me on social media as well, just at Billy Dees, pretty much that easy. Thank you again, Erika, very much. And I'll also say thanks to the audience, and we'll be back again next week. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Well, hello, everyone. I am Billy Dees from the self-titled Billy Dees podcast. You can find me on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and many more of the best podcast networks. Join me for my commentary and interviews. Follow me on Twitter, real easy to find, at Billy Dees. I am Billy Dees. I'd love to have you listen in.